Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. A weekly feature on 93.5 FM and live streaming at lakefm.com. Here's the president of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, John Denuzzo.
Welcome to Lake George Battlefield Moments. This is John Denuzzo of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, and I'm delighted to have back in town our trustee, Bruce Benter. Welcome back to the North Country, Bruce.
Thanks, John. I just rolled in last night about 8:30. Boy, it was quite a ride, 11 and a half hours.
Oh, and where do you come from, Bruce?
Goochland, Virginia.
I see.
Halfway between Richmond and Charlottesville.
Okay.
Beautiful location. I love it there.
It is a beautiful country. I mean, I was a resident of Northern Virginia for a short time, and
so was I.
It's a beautiful area. Well, we got Bruce back in the hopper here. We got some real important things. Obviously, as May comes along, summer is on the way back to us. Certainly the warm weather is here, but a lot of important anniversaries at Lake George and Lake Champlain region, including at our own Lake George Battlefield Park. On May the 11th, 1775, Fort George was relinquished by the British to the Patriots. Bruce, what you can tell us about that day and what happened prior and after?
Well, of course, you had on April 19th, 1775, you had the shot heard around the world at Lexington and Concord. And that prompted a lot of momentum in the revolutionary cause. And one of the results of that will be the capture of Fort Ticonderoga, His Majesty's Fort at Crown Point, and Fort George. And if you think about it, the British had maintained these forts, not in good condition, I might say. They're very dilapidated condition. But if you wanted to get a message from New York City all the way up to Quebec and Canada, you needed those forts as intermediary locations. In other words, the message would travel from New York up the Hudson to Albany, then from Albany up to Lake George, where you had Fort George, from Fort George up Lake George to Ticonderoga, Crown Point, and then eventually Canada. So it was a corridor that was well known in the 18th century, but the British had really let these forts really go to hell, actually. Wow.
Were they just ignorant of their importance, or just lackadaisical that no one was going to threaten them?
Well, I think the latter is more appropriate, because the French and Indian War ended in 1763, and so by 1775, we have over a decade where there has been no hostilities within the region either. So the British wanted to maintain the forts as a presence, but they certainly sent invalid soldiers to be there. They didn't send their best commanders there, and the forts had fallen into disrepair. For instance, Crown Point, they had a fire in 1773, and it destroyed most of the parapet walls. The only thing that were left were the limestone barracks. So even the cannons that were mounted on the walls fell into the dirt and sand between the two walls at Crown Point. Fort George was originally constructed in 1759 by Lord Amherst, Geoffrey Amherst, who was the British commander-in-chief towards the end of the French and Indian War. And he led an expedition to try to capture Ticonderoga, which at the time the French called it Fort Caroline. And once he captured it in record time, and so there was no need to finish Fort George. So basically, only one bastion of a four-bastion fort was constructed, and then everything stopped. And eventually, the British would hold on to the fort, but they never did anything else in terms of repairs. They put a half-pay captain, a man who was Swedish, actually, and he had maybe 2 or 3 soldiers with him. He was given an opportunity to live in a cottage right next to the fort, and he could plant a garden and raise vegetables and things like that. But essentially, he was just living there just to make sure there was a presence for the British, but not an important presence. There's a little bit of chronology might help here. In 1755, the French and Indian War basically breaks out. George Washington had started it the year before down in Pennsylvania. And Sir William Johnson, General Johnson, comes up here, fights the Battle of Lake George. It's too late in the season to go and capture Crown Point, which is what he wants to do, Fort St. Frederick. And so he starts to build Fort William Henry. And he starts to build it in the fall of 1755. It's completed in 1756. General Montcalm, the French commander up at Fort Caroline, decides to capture Fort William Henry in 1757. It's a story that everybody knows because of the Last of the Mohegans. And he captures the fort, burns the fort to the ground, and so there is nothing here. In 1758, General Abercrombie comes with an army of 15 or 16,000 men. His job is to capture Fort Caroline. He is extremely unsuccessful, resulting in massive casualties of 2,000 men. And he retreats from Caroline back down to Lake George, the southern shore of Lake George, and that's a failure. Still nothing is here. In 1759, a new British commander, Geoffrey Amherst, is made commander-in-chief. He brings an army to Lake George. He decides to build a fort here, which will become known as Fort George. The first of 4 bastions is built, but by the time that bastion is finished, Amherst has captured Fort Caroline and renamed it Fort Ticonderoga, and he's get ready to march to Montreal and Quebec and successfully end the French and Indian War.
I see. So, and we know that the Fort George was never really completed. As you said, only one of the bastions was finished. And yet it did have a capacity of 125 or so soldiers who could fit there. So, interestingly, from 59 when it was constructed through the end of the French and Indian War, the early years of the Revolution, it saw a lot of action, changed hands a lot. And that's a story we'll tell at another time. I want to focus on May the 11th, 1775, with a reminder that on May the 11th of this year, Mother's Day at 10 a.m., we're going to commemorate the taking of Fort George by the Patriots away from the British. More on that at the conclusion of this podcast. But who was involved on the Patriot side?
Let me just say one thing, though. I don't think the Alliance has ever done this before, commemorated the taking of Fort George
I think you're
with
right.
the way you're envisioning it. It's my understanding that there's going to be uniformed personnel there from Fort William Henry. We're going to have someone representing the captain, Norsberg, and also a person representing the American side.
That's
right.
right.
I think it'll be a great event for May the 11th.
It is.
Great way to start off Mother's Day.
Bring
your mother to the fort.
As you said.
Forget the flowers.
That's why we're scheduling it for 10 a.m. You can go to the Fort George ruins inside Lake George Battlefield Park. We're going to have a pretty crisp ceremony that Bruce described, probably about 45 minutes or so, including some context for what happened. And then you can take Mom to brunch and after you see the rest of the Battlefield Park. But I want to ask you, Bruce, you seem to suggest in an email recently that it wasn't Captain Romans who took the fort from the British on behalf of the Patriots. But first of all, tell us about Bernard Romans, where he came from, and what happened on May the 11th, 1775.
Yeah, he was also a foreigner. He had a lot of experience in Florida. The British had a colony down there, West Florida. And Romans was trained as an engineer, but he also was a botanist. So he was doing a lot of work for the British government in terms of explaining to them what life was like in West Florida and also how to understand the environment down there. And then, of course, if anything needed to be engineered, he was available too. And then around 1774, he decided to make his way up to Connecticut, where he got involved with the revolutionary movement, which is kind of unusual. Not unusual, but it's different that he would be a government employee, so to speak, and then go over to the American side. But while he made his way up to Hartford, Connecticut, he heard about an expedition that was going to capture Fort Ticonderoga. And he sort of became a hanger-on to that expedition. He went along with a fellow named Noah Phillips. They made their way up from Connecticut through Massachusetts up to Bennington, Vermont. And Bennington, Vermont, of course, is going to be the focus of where Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys became known as the Bennington Mob. And I guess in our next segment, we're going to talk more in depth about Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys. But suffice it to say, Romans ends up at Bennington. He's also with a fellow named Edward Mott, Captain Mott, who is an attorney and a militia captain. He is involved with the organization of this expedition to capture Fort Ticonderoga. But unfortunately, and I want to get into a little more depth of Romans at the event, but he apparently rubbed people the wrong way. I know you never come in contact with anybody like that. Well, maybe me once in a while.
Not
I
even
rub
in
you
the
the
studio,
wrong way.
no.
But yeah, Romans. I don't know whether he was a know-it-all or he thought he was superior or what have you. But he really grated on Captain Mott, and so he didn't get beyond Bennington. He didn't go up to Castleton, up to Hans Cove with the Green Mountain Boys to capture Ticonderoga. They said, get out of here. And so he ends up going down to Fort Edward. He hears about Fort George and the possibility that, maybe that is a place that should be captured. And that would be a great place to have in terms of a continuation of that corridor that I was talking about, where you have Albany to Fort George to Ticonderoga to Crown Point, and then the entrance into Canada. And so he tries to organize about 15 men or so at Fort Edward to go and take Fort George. But there's a very good source that says that Romans showed up after the fort was already captured. There's a wonderful diary kept by one of the Green Mountain Boys named Ephraitus Bull, B-U-L-L. And he talks in his diary about after Fort Ticonderoga is captured, in the evening hours, they rode down Lake George. 3 or 4 Green Mountain Boys knock on the door of Fort George. The captain comes out, Norseberg. He surrenders the key to the fort to these Green Mountain Boys. The Green Mountain Boys are there on the night of the 10th. On the 11th, Romans shows up. Now, there's another story, and actually, the Alliance newsletter published a story about this. A fella named Daniel Parks, who was local to the area, the Queensbury area, he supposedly is given credit on his gravestone for capturing the fort. Now, I think that Daniel Parks is probably with Romans, and they're together with these 15 men or so on May the 11th when the fort is really taken over by the Americans. But I think that there's a lot of confusion, and I think that if we go by the primary sources that are available, we can kind of sort of question whether Romans should be the guy that gets credit for capturing Fort George, although that's the standard storyline for people that write about this time period and the capture of Ticonderoga. They seem to want to just slough off the primary source and just give credit to Bernard Romans. After the capture of the fort, Romans will start looking for a job, and he ends up getting a job from George Clinton, who is a brigadier general in the Revolution at this time. And Clinton is in charge of the works on the Hudson River. Bernard Romans will go down there and build some fortifications on an island opposite West Point. Of course, it wasn't called West Point at the time, and it wasn't called Constitution Island at the time, but it becomes known as Constitution Island. And Romans will build a fortification there. I believe he has some work to do on Fort Montgomery, which is a little bit south of West Point. And so that's what he ends up doing.
An interesting twist on the standard story, Bruce.
Yeah,
Thank you.
everybody's telling me, well, tell a story about Romans. And I think there's more than one story to tell, and I'll let you figure it out. But I don't place a lot of credibility in the Daniel Parks story. I just don't think he was the big factor but because he was a local boy, he's getting the credit.
Okay.
As you would get credit because you're a local boy here,
Thank you.
You would give it,
And like
but
you
it
would
might
get-
be me coming from Virginia to take the
Goochland,
fort.
yes,
Yeah,
like,
see?
you're a big
There you
name
go.
in Goochland.
That's
they
right.
say that being with Bruce in
you-
Goochland is like being with Sinatra in Vegas.
Yeah.
I mean, he rules
You're
the
right.
town. We thank you, Bruce. Now, a reminder that on Sunday, May the 11th, Mother's Day, 10 a.m., at the ruins of Fort George, where this actually happened, we'll have that ceremony, including Bruce Venter, author of The Battle of Hubbardton and CEO of America's History, LLC, Pat Niles, another Alliance trustee who's the president of the Washington County Historical Society, Andrew Minzy from Fort William Henry, John Eric Nelson, a longtime and well-known historian as well. So encourage you to come. If you're listening to this prior to May 11th, come visit us there. Free admission, and our visitor center will be open that day. Thank you for joining us on the Lake George Battlefield Moments podcast.
Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. For more on this topic, check out the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance podcast, a weekly feature on Lake FM 93.5 FM and live streaming at lakefm.com. For more information, go to lakegeorgebattlefield.org and tune in every Saturday morning for Lake George Battlefield Moments.